I am probably the only panelist here who is not a Sanskrit scholar and barely even a Sanskrit speaker. My Sanskrit credentials are that I am a very slow and hopeful learner. I have started learning Sanskrit several times in the last 3 or 4 years. And I have barely acquired speaking competence, I'll admit that. But I have found myself on the threshold of great joy, great meaning and purpose, not only as a student of Sanskrit, but really as a media scholar and as somebody who believes that media, despite all the propaganda and all the problems with the media today, can still play a role for a better world, for a better tomorrow. And I think Sanskrit can be the inspiration. Sanskrit can be the inspiration for giving us a vision for media to drive a better sense of tomorrow. So I just wanted to outline a few ideas I had, and some of the ways in which reading about Sanskrit and trying to learn Sanskrit has raised some questions for me about certain ideas that have been the bedrock of my field of media studies. So in a sense, when I say media and Sanskrit, I want to clarify, I don't want to try and say these are the ways in which we can popularize Sanskrit through the media. I think that is already happening through apps like Language Curry and through YouTube and so many platforms. I certainly wish more could be done. I do want to share one anecdote, though, about Sanskrit and the media on a autobiographical note. One of the first moments of my exposure to Sanskrit, I mean, apart from temples and pujas at home, took place in the early 1980s when I was a teenager. I had the honor, just by accident, of being present in a screening theater in New Delhi where the National Film Awards jury was watching G.B. Iyer's film Adi Shankara. So my mother at the time was on the National Film Awards jury, and she forced me to go along with her and watch Adi Shankara. And I was a teenager. I was not very keen on it. But I have to tell you, even at that age, experiencing the intensity of that movie and the beauty of that language and the greatness of the ideas contained, I think gave me a sense deep down that someday all this would be clear. So I'm very grateful to the 1984 National Film Awards jury for recognizing Adi Shankara as, the first movie made in Sanskritam in India. So I was a part of that, historic moment, and a little footnote there. So today I just want to quickly share 2 or 3 questions that have come up for me. So it's not so much about how to popularize Sanskrit I want to try and propose, but really how to Sanskritize the condition, the experience, and the meaning of mediation itself. Okay? So in media studies today, we no longer see the media as just discrete units that are sending information packets or data bits. I mean, the engineers do that, but in the liberal arts, we look at the whole of society today really as being steeped in the condition of mediation. I mean, we are constantly mediated with our phones, with our social media, with images, with language, with emojis. So in this condition of mediation, what could possibly happen if the way in which we were mediated absorbed something of the Sanskrit vision, the Sanskrit philosophy, as it were, the philosophy of language and meaning in Sanskrit. So that's the broad goal I'd like us to think about, and how I've come to think about it. Again, there's some wonderful books I'll just share in a moment, like Acharya David Frawley's book about Mantra Yoga, for which Dr. Sampath has written a wonderful introduction, Ram Swarup's book on names of God. So a few books have really opened my thinking. And not only have these books opened my thinking about the role of Sanskrit, but they have also left me somewhat awestruck and also confused about everything we've been teaching in my field, in media studies. So specifically, there are two questions I want to briefly outline on how essentially Sanskrit has upended my received wisdom, as it were, in media studies. Um, so the first of these has to do with the historiography of media. I started teaching a class called Media History about 2 or 3 years ago. And what I found very predictable there is that typically classes on media history, textbooks on media history, organize the chronology in 3 or 4 phases. They start with oral communication, then they go to the invention of writing and written communication, invention of print, Gutenberg, printing press, etc. And then they move on to the electronic age, radio, television, computers, internet, and so on. So the textbook I prescribed my class was doing that too. And I started out and, my expectation was I would talk about oral communication for a few minutes and that would be about it, because it's the very typical cliches you find in American textbooks, in Eurocentric textbooks about quote unquote oral communication, right? They'll say that, there were storytellers who gathered around a fire and told stories or poems, and they were religious chants and things like that. And I mean, that is about all students were learning. But luckily, around the time I was speaking about this phase, I began to discover there were a lot of other questions that were coming together. Partly I learned through Ram Swarup's book and through some other books as well. So this is the book by Ram Swarup, The Names of God. And this is the book I'd mentioned by Dr. David Frawley, Mantra Yoga and Primal Sound. So with books like this and some reading I started doing on the history of evolution and speech. And I should also mention that my interest in questions of evolution and speech and animal communication, for lack of a better word, also came about because I've been writing a trilogy, a fictional trilogy inspired by Hanuman called the Kishkinda Chronicles. So all these questions came together in my media history classes for me. And I began to realize that in Sanskrit philosophy, in understanding the philosophy of sound, that is there in traditional Indian knowledge, we can start opening up the way we understand history itself, natural history, social history, communication history, and questions about how voice evolved, questions of how symbols evolved. So basically now I do fun things in my class, like I make my students read out some names and guess the order. And then I draw attention to the fact these are in the Sanskrit consonant order. So suddenly they realize there's so much going on in our human anatomy, to produce speech, and they never even thought of it. So that's one way Sanskrit, I think, has really made me think about media history. The second question, and this is a much bigger one, so I'll just share the wonderment I feel at the moment about this question, and we could perhaps the scholars could also address it in passing if you get a chance. The other question has to do with the issue of meaning. So media studies today is really centered on the question of meaning and how things come to mean. So this turn, which is often called, the semiotic turn, began in the 60s and 70s in the British critical cultural studies tradition. And what it means basically is that for 30, 40 years, we've all been teaching our students that meaning is arbitrary, right? The relationship between the signifier or, the physical form of the sign and its meaning is not natural. It just happens through convention, and it's political, and so on and so forth. So while this is useful as a tool for deconstructing, power relations in society, I have now come to appreciate, again, largely through Ram Swarup's book and some of these other books that I've been reading, that in the origins of Sanskrit, there's a lot more than arbitrary, this is a cat, this is a dog, stuff going on. That every sound has been chosen, or the sound has chosen us, I don't know, to represent something very, very natural, something very beautiful, something organic. And that totally, throws open the entire meaning paradigm in media studies, as it were. So I'm very fascinated by, that question of meaning. Where do we go with the whole critical media studies tradition, where students of today are being taught everything is arbitrary, and we start to recognize that, one of the oldest languages in the world, something so primal and natural like Sanskritam, has a different take on meaning. So those are the two questions I think, my field is confronting. But to conclude, I want to leave us with one brief quote and a broader question. So what could we do, for people who work in media, who are studying mass communication or media or liberal arts today broadly, where could we take, our fields, with Sanskritam? And I think the two broad things that could happen, one is we really rethink the relationship between the form of the word and its meaning, the sound in the word. And I think it can also be applied in visual and performing arts when we start thinking about issues like gesture in art and yoga and asanas. I think, we could really talk about a new kind of aesthetics, which is rooted in Indian knowledge, but also reflective of current concerns in the world. So I think what Sanskritam and yoga could do today, really, in the academia and in the media, is to push us towards a new consciousness, which is also instrumental, which is also the cornerstone for a new social order, or a social, more accountable and kind social world, as it were. So I'll just take one more minute to read the conclusion from Ram Swarup's book. And it really struck a chord, because today students are being taught meaning is arbitrary, everything is political and all that. And it's good they understand, the connection between culture and politics. But where I think today's academia is very limited, and where the divinity and sanctity of communication that we can find in Sanskritam is necessary, I'll just read out the last paragraph from Ram Swarup. If man knew how to invoke God's names properly, they could raise him up individually and would also have important social bearing. For example, some of the names of Ganga are Amala, Vimala, Nirmala, meaning spotless, stainless, pure. If he had meditated on these names, we could not have polluted this great river, nor in fact any other great river. If he had meditated on these names and they had left their vibrations within us, if we had seen something of their beauty and purity, if we knew that they are part of us and we are part of them, then how could we pollute our atmosphere, shut out the sky with smog, choke the air and the earth with poisons of all kinds? If we knew the earth was a mother, we could not have mined away its soil and exploited and deleted it with such unscrupulousness. If he had meditated on compassion, daya or anukampa, we would not have made a roaring business out of the pain and tears of our fellow creatures, the animals and birds. The world suffers from exploitation, cruelty, bestiality, and pollution because the gods and their names have gone out of our lives. So I hope we will restore the gods and their names in our lives. Thank you.